And we're so happy to have you. This is our artist, Andrei, who's super world famous. He's exhibited in, you did Belgium, right?
No, I did.
You have a piece over there.
Yes, well, I showed actually this piece.
That piece, all right. Which is
in
the
Austria.
piece we're going
It
to
was
start
Austria.
with. And so without further ado, I'm going to let Andrei tell you about this amazing exhibition.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Rentería. I'm an artist working and living in San Antonio, Texas, but I'm originally from a small border town in far west Texas called Presidio, Texas. It borders Ojinaga, Chihuahua, where my family is from. So I assume that, like many of you, I grew up on both sides of the border. And I stayed there pretty much my entire life until I went off to college. And even then, I was still living nearby. I consider myself a person, or I guess an artist, that focuses on social political issues along the border. Being that I grew up in the area, you kind of get to know how things work. And so during my earlier years or during my undergrad years, I remember just playing around with materials and so on, and a person told me, or a friend of mine told me, he's like, why don't you, because I had no idea what to do as far as subject matter, and a person told me, it's like, why don't you focus on things that you know? And for whatever reason, when she said that, something clicked. And so I've always been interested in storytelling. And so I began to tell the stories or try to portray the stories that I knew. I'm not sure if you guys are very familiar with the west part of Texas, cities like El Paso and across the Rio Grande, Juarez. But growing up, I would always hear the stories of Las Muertas de Juarez. You know, it literally translates to the dead women of Juarez, because back then there was really no concept of what a femicide was, right? Which is the killing of a woman because she's a woman. So basically just a crime based on gender. And growing up hearing the stories and the different type of theories as to what they, or why they happened, led me to kind of focus my artistic journey, or at least with this series, into that matter. And I originally began the series with the concept of a person that had disappeared. I was very into the history of Latin America, not just Mexico in itself, but just history in Latin America. And one of the repeating methods I guess like one of the repeating things that would happen in each country when it was at war with itself was the disappearances of certain sectors of the population. And I began to question as to why that happened. So I started to understand that these were methods that were used, or language that was being used in a war to intimidate, to set terror amongst the population. So I initially began with the idea of the disappeared, but upon trying to recruit models, I quickly understood that men tended to be a little bit more evasive. They did not want to participate, and women were kind of the ones that volunteered a little more to be photographed. And so when I was looking at my sources of photographs, I realized, like, whoa, this isn't just about men and women who have disappeared. This is solely on women. So I was like, this is a series about femicide. So I began to kind of create fictitious cases with each particular drawing that I created. Now, it's important for me to say that they're fictitious cases because I did not want to, my goal was not to sort of exploit the story of a particular person, which I felt like that's what I was doing. If I was going to tell their story, make art, sell it. It's like I feel like I would be gaining some sort of monetary value based on somebody else's tragedy. So I didn't want to do that. So I began to just create fictitious stories that pull together different elements of different disappearances and putting them to create my own case. So I used friends of mine or volunteers as the models and then put them in sort of a vulnerable position based on what I was reading on the news of how people's bodies were being found or displayed. And though they have elements of reality, again, most of them are just made up stories. But in them, I began to tell the stories of mothers who were in search of justice for their daughters who had been killed, of reporters who had also been killed for trying to tell the truth of what was happening in the world around them. One in particular is the story this case is based on the story of Marisela Escobedo Ortiz. Marisela Escobedo Ortiz was a mother who was in search of justice for her daughter Ruby, who had been murdered by her husband in Ciudad Juarez, and whom in 2010 had been killed in front of Chihuahua's government palace, right in the middle of downtown. I think there's a Netflix documentary that came out about that, but I had learned of Marisela when I was visiting Chihuahua, where I was born. I was born in Chihuahua City, and I was downtown looking for bookstores. I was looking for used books, and I remember passing by the plaza across the government palace, and I remember seeing this gigantic cross with a bunch of spikes on it with strings and tags with names on them. So I asked my sister what that was about, because I was completely unaware of what was happening. And she told me the story, and it's like, oh, those are the names of women who have disappeared, not just in Juarez, but throughout the state. Actually, there's a woman who is protesting her daughter's disappearance right in front of the government palace because 3 state judges released the murderer of her daughter. And so she's been there for I don't know how long. And upon returning home, because I remember this was at the height of the war on the drug war, or the war on the narco. I remember my sister telling me like around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, it's getting dark, we should probably head home. Things can get kind of crazy. So upon arriving home, turning on the television, listening on the news that Marisela had just been murdered right in front of the government palace. They display the video footage, and you see her running towards the doors of the palace, and the gunmen chasing after her and shooting her. And upon that happening, the activist population set this sort of plaque in front of the government palace, installing it, I guess, illegally in remembrance of her fight for justice. And so I named it, and I'll probably butcher this because it's not, I think it's German, but it's called a Stolperstein. And after World War II, when men and Jewish when Jewish families were being taken from their home and displaced and taken to camps, an artist, I forget the name of the artist, but he created a project in which he would put or install little plaques that were square in front of the houses where these families had been taken from. And so I kind of created that correlation with what was happening, or what they did with Marisela. There's other cases, such as the case of this young man, and I'm not going to remember his name, but Javier Lardizabal's story. He was actually a state police officer who was in charge of investigating the femicides in Juarez. And after months of investigation, or after months of taking over the investigation, he was later kidnapped, tortured. His body was thrown in a field with police handcuffs tying up his body. After that, I guess the evidence was picked up by the state police itself, and somehow those handcuffs with a particular serial number disappeared from the evidence room. So I use my artwork in order to sort of speak about the truth of what's happening and the lack of state's commitment to solving these crimes. About 90% of Mexico's homicides are never solved. And it's probably even higher now, higher count than that. And so with that in mind, I decided to do these drawings on what is called vellum paper. Now, vellum paper is sort of a drafting paper that they use for architecture. And if you ever touched it, it's very kind of waxy, it's kind of plastic-like. And so a lot of people think that these are charcoal on paper, but in reality it's litho crayon. So I don't know if you're familiar with lithography. It's a printmaking process in which you draw on a stone. And so it's a very waxy crayon. And so when you draw with that crayon on this paper, it's, it kind of slicks. The pigment itself doesn't permeate. It doesn't get soaked by the paper, right? Usually paper has these grooves, these little holes in which either charcoal or a powdery medium gets into. Well, that doesn't happen here. So the crayon is just sort of suspended on the surface. And so I use that material to talk about the vulnerability of the evidence, the vulnerability of the story, right? Because if the crayon, or let's say the story, the evidence, is only suspended on the surface, then it's easier to wipe away, to erase, to be forgotten. So I'm using that material sort of in a poetic manner, and that is something that continues throughout the different series that I create. I'm very much interested in, or I'm very much influenced by an artist, an Austrian-German artist whose name was Gustav Metzger, and he grew up during the Cold War. And so he wrote a manifesto called the Autodestructive Art Manifesto. And in it, he describes how art should be self-destructive to reflect the self-destructiveness of human beings. And he was doing so in order to talk about the use of nuclear weapons at the time. And I just thought that was the perfect formula for me to follow in talking about these types of issues along the border. The text in it describes sort of how the person disappeared. They're wrote sort of in a forensic or investigative manner. As you can see, they're sort of like in the format of what would be a notepad, right? So in different series, I kind of take different roles. I guess they could be insider roles or outsider roles. In this case, I'm sort of an outsider role. I take the role of an investigator, of a reporter who is writing down or who is trying to figure out what happened with each individual case. You might notice certain rings or remnants on the drawings. Got the idea of, setting down your cup on a piece of paper, right, with notes spread all over. This series was probably double the number of these drawings. So when I first displayed them, they were kind of like put together more, closer in proximity to each other, overlapping. And so that was the idea, cases that continue to pile up and pile up. And the person who's trying to documenting not being able to get, I guess, enough rest to try to solve them. Called fringes, not just because of the fringes of the paper like you would when you tear a sheet of paper, but also to talk about the populations that are on the periphery of society, right? The most vulnerable. Let's see, let's go ahead and move on to this series. So this was done this was done in 2018, I think. And the series that followed was this series of drawings of funerary wreaths. So I used that motif to, I guess, as a way to remember those who have died during the war on the narco, but then also at the same time taking on a different role. So I think it's very easy for us to divide certain issues into black or white, right or wrong. But when you live on the border, you realize that it's a much more complex and intricate way of life. Everybody knows someone who might be involved in the wrong type of work, let's call it. They might have family members like I did. And so nothing is so black and white. It's sort of gray areas. But I was reading about a story in which a journalist in Peru, a particular journalist in Peru who had been exposing the work of a government-backed death squad during the 1990s to disappear people who were affiliated with the Shining Path, which was a terrorist organization in Peru who was fighting the government. They were socialist, communist, and so they were disappearing people all over the country. And so when this journalist started to expose extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and the type of work that they were doing around the state, his son who was probably in elementary school, maybe 5 years old, ended up receiving a funerary wreath with his name on it at the school. And so I use that motif, again, sort of as a symbol of something that has two meanings, right? Sure, funerary wreaths are used to remember the person or honor the person who has passed away, but if the person is still alive, it is a threat to the person. And so I created different drawings based on that, and sort of following with the same nature of these, drawing them on vellum, a very transparent, a very waxy paper, but it started incorporating sculptural aspects to them, in this case a truck door. And so, as you can see, the truck is charred or burnt. There's bullet holes in them. And so, though they might seem sort of, I guess they're put in a certain pattern, right? Because then I began to understand that professional hitmen or killers tend to hit this area. And the reason for that is because if they hit this area of the door, they're likely to hit the torso of the person sitting behind the door. They're not just sporadically shooting someone that is unprofessional. This is someone that knows exactly what they're doing. So again, I'm taking on a different role there, right? Instead of being a journalist, now I'm taking the role of a hitman. You had a question?
Was the shooting like from when they were trying to shoot the person inside the car, or were they just outside the car?
Outside the car. So yeah, these are the bullets going in and coming out the back way in here into the door. And the truck door, I had to go to a junkyard and ask the person, like, hey, you got any burnt up vehicles in here? He's like, yeah, we got one. It's back there. So it's like, I need a door. He's like, all right, take it off yourself. So I acquired the door that way. I did the drawing on vellum and then adhered it to the surface. I had to shoot the door myself. It didn't come with the bullet holes. And as I'm kind of creating these pieces, I'm intaking a lot of news, right, and stories. And at the time, I think when I was creating this piece, a journalist by the name of Miroslava Bric, who is from Chihuahua City. Well, she's from the kind of like the mountainous region of Chihuahua State, but she was killed in Chihuahua City. And I followed her work. And the reason she got killed was because she exposed the ties between a political party in her hometown and narco traffickers who were backing this person's political campaign. And so if you come around and look at the back of the door, there's text that has been etched into it, and it says por lengua larga, which loosely translates for being a loud mouth. And so, again, I'm using the language that is evolving or that has been used in my artwork to create it and to expose it. Obviously, this sort of door kind of becomes a frame into other pieces, such as this one. I think a lot of people look at the cross and it's like, oh, it's upside down, and that kind of throws them off. But if you look at the title, I tend to play with titles a lot, too, you know? So, like this one's called El Pro, or the professional. And the piece in the background is called Como le dieron piso a San Pedro. So it's sort of slang that translates how St. Peter was executed. So if you know a little bit about, I guess, Catholicism or the Bible, St. Peter refused to be crucified like Jesus Christ because he said that he was unworthy of it, and so he asked to be crucified upside down. And so I'm kind of using that to talk about, maybe these people that are considered unworthy of society, unworthy or unimportant to the rest of society. Their stories tend to get ignored, shoved aside. Nobody wants to talk about them. And so I kind of continued with these messages. You might notice that this one, for example, is put in an envelope. Again, it's a funerary wreath, but it's a sealed envelope, kind of like how they did back in the day where they would put wax seals on them. But if you look close enough, there's little text that was imprinted on there, and it says, para los que no creían, for those who didn't believe. And I took that from a story of, I think it was a police officer, I'm not quite sure, I forget, there's so many. But it was a police officer in the city of Juarez who his body was publicly displayed and crucified in front of the police station with a pig mask on his head and a message that said, for those who didn't believe, or para los que no creían. And that was sort of a warning to the police officers or the police force who were not, how they were saying, who were reluctant to affiliate themselves with the cartel. And so, I'm taking all these little bits of information, language, and using that to title my works. You might notice that they're sort of in a weird frame and sort of in a decorative frame, right? And I'm using that to resemble sort of a grid, right? And the idea of the grid is what happens when forensic archaeology investigations happen on the field, right? They create a quadrant, they divide that, and they slowly start to dig for information. So if you notice, some pieces might have been lost, but on the corners you'll see residue of wax, and then you'll see human teeth on there that are glued to the corners. Sort of like the evidence of what happens, or the evidence that is left of the person. At the entrance, you might have noticed the giant joint and the bigger piece. Well, two bigger pieces. One of them says dolor. And that one's called the narcomanta, which are these sheets that carry messages that are handwritten, that are left in public places as displays to send messages amongst different cartels or to society to send a warning. But you might have noticed that that there are clippings from newspapers. So the idea that not only do they send messages publicly through these handwritten sheets, but they also use the media to send out messages to themselves or to the rest of society and newspapers. The idea too that they have not only that they have police officers under their pay, but they also have politicians, they have journalists, etc. I guess in continuing with the idea of titles, the joint in itself, it's titled El Toque Antes del Grito. So that has double meaning as well. A toque could be a toke, right? Or a hit of a marijuana cigarette, but it also translates to a toque, a touch, or something that is being played loudly, right? So in that, I'm playing with that language and incorporating Mexico's national anthem. El toque antes del grito translates the sound before the cry, or the toque before the cry. So if you know Mexico's national anthem, it talks about Mexicanos al grito de guerra, Mexicans at the cry of war, right? So it's like here, kind of talking about like what these people who are involved in an internal war have to do to cope, I guess, with or what they have to do in order to initiate this type of violence. And a lot, from what I read and from what I hear, it's like most of the times these hitmen are always drugged up because they can't really bear with what they've done in their past or their mistakes and so on. That kind of continues and carries to the metal drum piece here. It's sound activated. Here we have a 5-gallon industrial metal drum. Again, I use the motif of the funerary wreath. You have a banner across it that reads quota, or the quota. So the quota on society for a war that continues to this day. As you approach it, sound will go off and you'll hear the war drums play, right? And it's a sort of like a tradition in Mexican schools, primary schools, secondary schools, where they have sort of this drum line, and it's very much follows kind of like a military drum line, and that's the sort of music that they play. They use it to sort of start I guess the national anthem before school starts. I don't know if many of you have gone to school in Mexico and remember that. How many of you have gone through that? A few of you. So you guys kind of remember that. So that's what they do. They gather everyone in the courtyard. Here comes the marching band or the drum line. They play the drums, they carry the flag, and so on. So I'm kind of using that to not just talk about, again, like sort of the messages that are instilled on society with a very patriotic anthem, right? But then also to talk about how cartels or even the government tends to disappear people. I don't know if you heard the story of a person that worked for the Tijuana, and I think he worked for the Tijuana cartel and for the Sinaloa cartel at some point, but they called him El Pozolero, or the stew maker. And what he would do is he would disappear people in metal drums and fill them up with, I guess he would create some sort of lime potion and dissolve bodies in there. So every piece, so it's not just like again, continuing with the material, right? The material in itself has some sort of meaning or has some sort of, or symbology in it. It's not just random choices of material, from the paper to the metal drum, etc. The language in itself, we have, The drawing is a house that was destroyed and I think burnt up by the cartel, and you'll see like a little drawing of a bulldozer on there. Other types of language that is used, you know, like being a dedo, or someone who points the finger at someone for blame, right? And sort of like this sort of punishment. So being that the box was a razor blade box, I thought that that was probably the perfect box to put fingers on. The oreja, there's different little stories here. This is a story I think of, like, I forget the name of this kid, but his name was like, I think they called him like Pancho Pistolas or something, but he was like a little, he was like an 8-year-old hitman for the cartel. He was just a kid who was recruited by the cartel after they killed his dad, and so they just kind of gave him an ultimatum: either you join us or we kill you too. So he ended up becoming a hitman. Just different. There's elements of that language, being an algoan or being a falcon, or I guess like a hawk. Someone was a watchman for the cartel out on the streets. You'll see the cell phone antennas, you know, the way they're communicating information. This is sort of like DIY grenade launchers that the cartel came up with. This tells the story of a military helicopter that was brought down by the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación back, I think maybe like 2008 or somewhere around 2010 maybe, I forget the dates. But there's different stories. This is the story of a family, a Mormon family who was killed in Chihuahua and were confused. They were crossing the border from New Mexico to Sonora and then Chihuahua, and they took a back road, and I think there had been some altercations between two factions, and upon seeing sort of a convoy of trucks or Suburbans, they thought they were of the opposing faction, and they decided to gun them down. I think they ended up killing nothing but women and children. I think one kid survived. So again, I'm sort of like chronicling. That's why I called my exhibition Border Chronicles, because I'm telling all these stories, sort of documenting that. And that's what I consider myself. I've always had this interest in journalism, but being that I'm not that great of a writer, I use the tools that I have, which are my drawing and painting tools, to tell these stories. I feel like I've talked so much.
Yeah.
I'll take questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andre. It's super informative. But yeah, questions. You wanna?
Yeah.
Do you have any pieces that you think were a little bit like really hard to work on?
Hard in what way?
Like emotionally, like any pieces that you felt like kind of overwhelmed?
Yeah, I would probably say that series right there. Just because it just kind of became in itself a massacre, right? It's like drawing a person and then figuring out ways to disappear them, torture them, and writing that down. Started kind of taking a toll on you, just reading these stories and figuring out, like, okay, what am I gonna do with them? Symbolically, right, of course. So it's kind of like, it starts to take a toll on you mentally. And I think at the time I was also like dealing with depression, so that didn't help. It just made heightened everything. So yeah, that series in particular was difficult.
You don't take any personal stories, like any of those stories on your work?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So I think like the reason why I decided to focus on this, I forget what they call this, or the use of this word. I'm gonna forget the word, but it's sort of, is it purgatory when you're trying to like, get rid of your,
Oh, yes, for Catholics, where because you don't go to heaven, you don't go to hell, you go to purgatory.
Oh, right, okay. So, I guess because I was growing up on the border, at some point in my youth, I became involved in certain things I shouldn't have been doing, right? And as I grew up, I realized maybe, or I became aware of the consequences of my actions back then. And so I think I continue on with this type of work or continue to tell these stories because of that, right? Maybe because of the guilt that I have. And so I think with my pieces, I tend to like want my audience to questions, you know, it's like what role do they play? And I think that's why I end up playing different roles in each series, right? It's like the reporter, the hitman, the victim, an outsider who doesn't really care, because I want society or the viewers of this work to question their own role. It's like, what role do they play? I feel like that's important. Yeah. So as far as real stories, I think my work has led me to become more of an activist. If you read my artist statements, I talk about how my investigative methods has changed. So while this is based on what I read on the news, I now take in the step to become my first resource. So now I'm going to the border. I'm working with mothers who have created collectives who are out in the fields looking for mass graves. And so I go with them and I document that, right? So it's like, let me take on more of the participant role and then base my work on that. You had a question?
Yeah, on the piece where you went from the picture plane that's not necessarily traditional, that looks kind of fan, that's framed, and then you said it evolved into the altar, just on methods of thinking, because you talked about writing. Did you build the picture plane in collage first and draw the part of it? You have separate pieces that you put in and edited out? What was your thinking as the stories went together to build a book or a movie? So
that's a good question. I think I'm not a very good planner. So whatever piece I get, I work on that, let the shape, let the text dictate what it's gonna be, and then based on that, I just find a place for it and slowly start to build. Some were a little bit more planned, obviously, right? After the chest piece, I figured, well, I need a head. And then I found an old calendar and I was like, well, that's a perfect one for the skull, you know? And so I planned those out. So I think like once I figured like it was gonna be a body or a skeleton, then it started to take on its own, I guess the pieces themselves had more of a direction. But again, based on the shape of the paper itself is what I tend to let that guide me. Yes?
You say you know, now you're more of that journalist kind of part of you, where you're talking to the people that you're making your artwork about. Do they ever give you any reaction, like, especially like someone who maybe was in the cartel or done stuff before? What is the reaction that you're an artist and you're trying to portray that?
I haven't, I guess, seen any of that yet. I know I've been told by a friend of mine who's still kind of involved in that type of world, because they tend to like brag about me. They're like, oh, like he's an artist now, you know, or like he got out of this shit, or like he made it out of this. Not that I was like heavily involved, but I definitely like. I definitely hung out with the wrong crowd, you could say, and did some favors for them that I shouldn't have been doing. Allegedly. But I've been told that certain people who work for the cartels, like, that they checked out my work. But they're like, oh, cool. You know? They think it's just cool. But again, they're just going by visuals, you know?
Sure.
They're not probably like reading into what each piece means.
Yeah, that's
Because again, I'm sort of criticizing, right?
yeah.
Mm.
Do you think that response might be because like a lot of the like cartel-related violence is performative and you know, cinematic in a way?
Yeah.
Like it's meant to send a message, it's meant to convey something, and meant to say something through what is done to whoever it is done to.
Sure.
And you're sort of in some way being cinematic and
Yeah.
not exactly performative physically, but
Mimicking
visually.
that. Yeah, absolutely. Probably, you know, it probably, and that's one thing though, it's that, I guess like that's what I'm trying to get away from, you know, because I realize like with movies, with series, it's like they glorify this type of behavior, and that's what I want to get away from. But being that I was taking on different roles, and I felt the need to explore that, like what does it mean to be this person in this world? I mean, it probably, resonates with them in that way. Yeah, I mean, that's probably why. I don't know. Other questions, comments? Yes? Oh, can we go with her and then we'll go back to you?
Sorry, I wanted to ask about this piece, like, I saw some papers were ripped out more cleanly than others, like this one was ripped out of the page like, perfectly. Is there like a meaning behind
Oh.
it?
Yeah, so you're talking about
Yeah,
like the rips here?
To remember notepads.
Yeah. So, I mean, that in itself is sort of like with the evolution of time, right? As you can see, they're on framed. If I really wanted to take care of them, they would be framed, right? But I don't. And remember that I was talking about how I was influenced by this Austrian artist who wrote about art should destruct itself. In a way, I'm kind of letting that slowly happen, right? So it's like they're on frame, you walk by, the drip hits them, they move, and slowly they start to kind of break down by themselves. I'm using unconventional materials. The coffee rings aren't coffee, they're motor oil, used motor oil. That over time is going to eat at that paper and it's probably going to fall off and destroy itself. So, so it's just the wear of time. Me handling, rolling them back up, putting them away, taking them out, unrolling them, and then slowly but surely fringes fall off, corners tear off, pieces of information, evidence gets lost. So it's not done on purpose, but it's just what happens. You got a question?
Yeah, you, I've noticed there's not necessarily a lot of color in these. Is
Yeah.
that intentional, more based on you don't want there to be color, or more like the materials you generally use are not necessarily colorful?
I mean, I was trained as a painter, and I love color, okay? I love color, but I feel like with this type of work and the things that I'm talking about, I feel like it also talks about that, right? It's like those gray areas that I was talking about. It's not black or white. It's like it's that also, but it's also a lot of areas in between. And so I think I've noticed like other people's work, other artists' works that tend to talk about the same issues in their work or have the same subject matter. They tend to do it in color, and so that to me either beautifies it, which is, or
Counterproductive.
yeah, you could say it's counterproductive, right? It's like it kind of beautifies it in a way that I don't like.
It doesn't meet your message.
Yeah, and so I thought I need to get rid of that color, right? And so therefore just black and gray. Yep. Other comments, questions? David?
Andrei, in the panel discussion that you had in San Antonio, you were talking about the fact that you were at actually cases in courts where you were.
Oh, yeah.
How did you come about that?
Well, out of necessity, right?
No, but how did they contact you?
Yeah. So what happened was, I got fired from working at a university teaching. They gave me the boot. And my wife was pregnant at the time. I needed work. And so I had a friend who worked at Telemundo as a videographer. And he knew that I drew, he knew that I was a teacher, and so on. And so the case of the 53 migrants that were found in that 18-wheeler happened, and I think the driver was having his court case at the time. And he's like, yo, we need drawings for this court case. Can you do them? I was like, well, I never done court drawings before. He's like, I was like, how much are you paying? He's like, I can try. And he's like, we'll pay you this much. Sign the contract with us. But it's it's just, what do they call it? I guess it's like all inclusive. Like it's just that. I couldn't sign with anyone else. So I show up to court. you know, with my pastels and little paper pad. And then other networks are there, and he's like, who are you? It's like, oh, I'm the court sketch artist, and they're like, are you inclusive? Who are you signed to? It's like, we need drawings too. And so I called my friend, I was like, dude, I have no job, my wife is pregnant, I need money. These guys are offering me to pay for images too. He's like, what do you need to do, man? So that's how I started to kind of network with different TV and news networks. And so they started calling me back for different cases. I'm not good at it, by the way. I think, like, man, I saw, like, I'm not. And the cases that I was being asked to cover, like, they were these types of hearings where it's like 10 minutes. So it's like super quick, you know, and like things happen very quickly in the court case. It's not like they're staying still for you.
Yeah.
So that was just sort of like a rude awakening into it. If you, don't Google them. I mean, you can Google them, but you'll see like how shitty these drawings are. I'll be honest. And like, read the comments on them, they're really funny. It's like, this guy needs to take some drawing lessons and blah, blah. And it's kind of hilarious. I was like, joke's on you, man, because I made like $2,000 based on this little shitty fourth-grade drawing. So that's how I kind of fell into it. I got called to cover the Maya Zambala case in El Paso as well. So I've been kind of fortunate to go into that, right? So it like kind of ties back into like the journalism work.
You probably already explained before, but for some of the cases that you did, if some of the prosecutors they realized the artwork you covered might have been crimes involving them, have any of them ever sent a message?
To me?
Just asking.
Yeah, no, they haven't. They haven't, but it's not like I don't think about that type of stuff, you know? And like I was telling you with my research, I've been like kind of becoming more involved in sort of activist work down in Mexico. And I think I've just been dealing with the same things that citizens of the country have been dealing with, you know? Like I traveled by bus, and sure enough, there was an illegal, what do they call this? It's like a roadblock, and some individuals with masks got on the bus, and they took money away from all of us, you know? So it's like I haven't personally been targeted, but because of my research, I've been dealing with the consequences of what the rest of the country is dealing with. But not personally, no. I have not.
Do you get worried that it might get to that point?
I do, but, you know, I think, again, it's like, you know, like what role do you want to play, you know, in society? Like I understand, you know, like now it's different, right? Like now I have a family, now I have a kid, and the last thing that you want is for something to happen to them based on what you're doing, right? But at the same time, it's like, you know, like when you think about history, right? World War II, like the Nazi party taking over, a lot of people decided to do nothing and just go with the flow, right? And not denounce, not protest, not take on an active role, and you know, it's like how is society gonna look upon me, you know, in the future? And I want to sort of, I just want to set an example to my kid, you know. It's like, hey, like this world is messed up, and we gotta do what we can in order to make it better, you know. Take your skills and do something productive with them, do something positive, and if you want to take on a particular role and try to change things, by all means, you know. But yeah, of course I get worried, but if you notice, like none of my work mentions certain people. I don't denounce like, fulanito de tal did this or that, and he is responsible for this or that. I don't, right? I'm just sort of documenting what happens. If that is gonna give me attention, the wrong type of attention, then I'm not the only one that they need to worry about, you know? I feel like I'm just sort of like bringing attention to a sector of society that is interested in art to also like become aware of that, you know, because they might not be informed. I don't feel like I'm outputting my message to the masses, I guess you could say. I don't have that stage yet, you know. I'm not putting it out like the New York Times or anything like that. But I mean, sure, something could happen. I don't know. I doubt it.
Are you hoping to be able to do that, or to help like others aspire to do what you're doing, or?
I think my hopes are to, I guess like, I don't even know how to answer that. I guess my dream, I think my dream for a long time was like, oh, I want to be an artist, right? I want to be an artist and make a living, and that's it. But I guess like my dream is for me to be able to continue to make work and have that work be of a certain, of a particular quality, that it can't be ignored, that it can't be put away. My hopes and dreams are to just continue to document, and for them to, you know, outlive me. And that's it. That's all I care about, really. I mean, if that can change somebody's perspective and somebody's life on an individual basis, then great, you know. I hope that happens for you. I switched my life around and way happier, and I feel like I'm doing a lot better.
Are there other, say, artists then that you might consider heroes or villains that your work would connect to in this time? Or because I'm thinking Enrique Chagoya, or locally Rigoberto Rizal,
Yeah.
But people you look at, because the one thing like Enrique Chagoya has is that lampooning where he, I guess, could get in trouble because he's making fun of people.
Sure.
Specifically, but humor, dark humor, because like your work seems to have that flip-flop of cultural affirmation and protest both, where we have to look at the puzzle and figure it out. So people that you're looking at as an artist, whether it's technique or content, that help you figure that out?
I mean, Rigoberto's work, I think, was a big revelation for me in regards to like what I didn't want to do, right? I mean, I love Baroque painting and that type of style, but then when I saw his work, I was like, oh, I don't want to do it. It doesn't portray the message, or it doesn't portray how I want it to be. Now I know what it looks like, and someone who's a lot more skilled than I am can do that. So, yeah, maybe it just became a revelation, like, I'm probably not going to do it better than him, and two, I don't like how it looks. I mean, I like his work, don't get me wrong, I think he's great, but it was a little, the presentation of it to me is not what I was looking for, I guess you could say. But I mean, I consider him, someone to look up to. Technically, he's amazing, you know, and the compositions that he creates are something that I aspire to create. Notice that a lot of my work is sort of like, kind of like mishmash, you know, like collage kind of way. I'm not creating scenes.
Do you know Paul Valadez up the road that you charge me as well?
No,
He
I
does
don't.
things on collage, but
No,
I mean, that almost Ouija board thing of having the message come through that layer, I find pretty cool. Even if it's about things that aren't cool.
Sure.
I give you a title, you know, like the envelope.
Yeah,
I like the way that, especially for students, learning on picking pieces and choosing. So that's why my question on the other one was, you edit stuff out? Was there other stuff that's sitting there awesome that could have been in that piece?
No, I don't. I don't edit myself out. Not really. I'm not that much. I don't produce that much work. I'll be honest. And so anything that I make, I have to display. Now, are there shitty drawings that I threw away?